2018 in England, near Winchester, England. A group gathered. According to Jeshua, in the most reliable source of material I've ever seen for the Way of Mastery, included a group of beings that were with him in his day. One was the reincarnation of John, the beloved, John the disciple, and there were many other who were close. And one, an essential player, was Judas, was the reincarnation of Judas. This being had worked on incorporating and getting to the point of reconciling this relationship with this past life, and more importantly, coming to the point of really embracing and having clarity around the true story of Judas, which had been lost to this soul. I'm struggling to try to decide how much of it should be shared and exactly how it should be presented, because a lot of it's personal. So I'll focus on what was the public sharing. This soul chose to address the group, standing before many that would be a challenge, as you could imagine why that might seem to be a challenge. And I will do my best to estimate what was happening, but I'll also share my experience of it. We're going to have a little bit of a break. The facilitators, Sarita Premley and her spiritual partner Israel, and J.M. John Mark Hammer were the facilitators for the group. And it was clear that the one who had been Judas was getting ready to talk, looking a little agitated, getting ready to talk. And they said, we can see that this is ready, something's ready to happen here. And we're going to take a little bit of we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and just have a 15-minute session in which they share, which Judas shares. So when I came back, having been told by Jeshua during that time that I was also a member of the brotherhood, the secret brotherhood that knew the plan that was unfolding at that time, very few did. Jeshua guided me to go over and to kiss the one who had been Judas on the cheek, as he had done for Jeshua when it was time for Jeshua's final initiation. And in a sense, this was my indication from the White Brotherhood that it was time for Judas's final initiation to stand up and to present himself in front of this crowd and to the world, in a sense, energetically. I was asked to sit down in front. So there's a circle of chairs and then a bunch of backjacks. And I always sit in the back. And Joshua said, sit down in front. So this time. And so I did on one of the backjacks. And so I had a view of Judas as this transformation occurred from the identity and soul of who they are in this life to that of Judas. And I've heard stories like this. I've seen a lot of channeling and a lot of really remarkable channeling. One that changed my life forever in Galilee with John Mark, J.M. Hammer, channeling Jeshua, changed me energetically forever. But this was unlike anything I'd ever seen, and I would wager unlike anything anyone in the room had ever seen. The face of this being actually started, it was as if the bones were moving in the face, and everything was changing so that they looked like a completely different being. The voice completely changed. And Judas spoke. This went on for a while. What I noticed happening as this was beginning was, I'll say, spiritual sight. But I could sense the largest number of beings that I'd ever sensed before. I'm not into the idea of dark forces. Jeshua suggests, he says, are there dark forces in the world? And he says, yes, but none they do not have any power that you do not give them. Nevertheless, there is this awareness at times of what could be called dark forces. Beings who are invested in the dream not ending, in the light not coming back, and so on. And it was as if suddenly something was happening in the atonement plan, in the unfoldment, a key essential, maybe the key essential piece in the entire multi-thousand-year history of it, in that Judas, who had this unique position of being the one most associated by the world, of being guilty and of being evil and being wrong, was now, through an honest process of truth-seeking and reconciliation and forgiveness of the world, Judas doesn't need to be forgiven, and this was beginning to be seen by this soul, but then also stepping forward to forgive the world for all the pain that soul had suffered from the projections put upon Judas. And as this began, it was as if millions of beings who are invested in the darkness were stunned and surprised that it was happening. There's a scene, I think often movies channel what's happening in the etheric, the reality that's happening. And at the end of Lord of the Rings, the eye of Sauron turns suddenly because it's being threatened. Well, that's exactly what that room felt like, but to me in reality. I have had this, and I felt like the room was being, in a sense, attacked while Judas was beginning the process of which would lead to Judas Arising. So instantly the room explodes with people doing light language, speaking in tongues, and these are people who I don't think do this usually. I start speaking in tongues. I think I've done it once or twice spontaneously in Israel once when something was happening. It's not something I identify with particularly. And there's more energetics going on in this room, and more terrifying, in a sense, energetics, larger energetics than anything I've ever experienced. It took me 3 weeks after I got back after the trip to shake it off. Whenever this type of thing happens, I call in Archangel Michael. I have a connection with Archangel Michael. And Archangel Michael just locks the room down. It's like snap, done, boom. Anything gets settled down by Michael real fast. I sense that Michael is in the room and is active, moving, and the room is still not secure. I sense that he's closing doors as soon as they're opened, keeping things out. I sense that Jeshua is in full defense mode, if you will, sword in hand, covering the room. And the room still it's not a done deal. And my sense was that all beings in that room stepped into playing their role, and it was only then that the room was sealed and closed and safe. So at one point, this recognition of what's happening, the turning of the world in a sense, the upsetting of the tables, not of the money changes, but of the dream itself, is literally taking place before our eyes. And it's stunning. And at one point, there's still this sense of issue with Judas. Like people still have issues with Judas, not able to see Judas in the real Judas, one of the keys to the whole plan, the co-creator of the atonement plan, the co-creator of all of it. One of the most trustworthy souls. It had to be that trustworthy in order to do the job. And so one of the people in the group goes and bows before Judas. And then and Judas is sitting. And then a line of people come up and do the same thing. And Judas is blessed, putting hand on head and so on, in loving touch. And then someone of the group comes up. I know this person really well. As he says, he doesn't cry. That's not something he does. It's a big deal for him if he cries, and he's sobbing. And he's sobbing to the point where standing in front of Judas and planning on kneeling down, and as the others have, but he can't. His legs are frozen. He can't move. He's just sobbing. And so Judas gets up out of the chair and meets him there. And occasionally in my life I've heard, as if you may know what the Akashic records are, And I just see it written clearly. And then Judas, let's get it right because it's important. And then Judas arose. From that moment on, things have been different. Judas goes on to address the group several times. And the key teaching is only love is real. I can tell you, my friends, this is Judas saying, guilt is not real. And if Judas stands freed of guilt by the truth, which one of us can stand in guilt and maintain that position? The answer is no one. And so into the matrix of the new world is built like a springboard. Whenever the attempt is to return to guilt, Judas has assured that the new world will bounce you back out and back into a recognition of reality and truth and the innocence which God has gifted you with and ensured will always be yours because God loves you. This pilgrimage to England continues. There was a second domino that fell shortly after Judas, and it was the soul of Hitler. Hitler's soul was healed. And we realized the connection between Judas and Hitler, because in a sense, if you want to look at the loving story of Hitler, he was just doing what he thought was the right. He was getting rid of the world of the Jews who he believed had killed Christ. He thought he was doing a good thing, probably from his own perspective. Whenever we see the truth of who we are, we understand and we are healed, that we know we're innocent. We've done mad and insane things, but not guilty by reason of insanity when we're in the dream of separation. There was actually a small ceremony for Hitler who wanted to be coronated at Winchester Cathedral, and we indeed brought Hitler, the soul of Hitler, to Winchester Cathedral, that he might be coronated, but not his egoic, hateful self, but his humbled, grateful, and Christed self. Also in this trip, I had mentioned a connection between the Newport Tower and the tour in Glastonbury. There had been a spontaneous and remarkable journey to the tour at Glastonbury in which the two springs, I believe it's the Red Spring and the White Spring, they said when they're joined again, heaven will come to earth. So we went and got water from each of the springs and brought them to the top of the tour and did a ceremony rejoining the split, the masculine and the feminine in perfect healed union. It's funny, I saw a movie just a little while afterwards, and in the exact spot that we were standing on the tour at in Glastonbury, they had in the movie they were opening a portal in that space. So it's just a couple of weeks later. The shared consciousness is reflecting itself in all manners of expressions. There were major events at Stonehenge. Basically, this progression continued, but the essential piece was this astonishing event of the arising of Judas and the forgiveness of Judas, but more importantly, the forgiveness by Judas, because that's the act which has taken on the sins of the world, received them as projections from everyone on an innocent being. Jesus was seen as the innocent being that everybody gave trouble, tortured and killed, right? But Judas was also an innocent being that was tortured in a sense and killed in a sense. And still, which was the easier role? Which would you rather play? I know which one I'd find more easy. The 3 hours of horrible difficulty and then being loved by the world forever, as Jesus was, as Joshua. But what about Judas? What about that role? That's a tougher role. And some soul had to have the greatness to play it. That's who Judas is. Maybe the most important being in the atonement plan. So I bow down to my dear friend Judas and the soul that has been able to do this and now speaks of the purity of heart and a purity of truth, which simply says, God loves you, you're innocent. I promise you this is true. God loves you, you're innocent. I promise you this is true. And a world of suffering and death and loss has been birthed from asking the question, what if we're guilty? What would it look like if we were guilty in this dream, in this movie? But think what a beautiful world we can create now that we know from lived experience that we're not, that our innocence is guaranteed by God. What beauty will we create? What heaven on earth? Thank you for listening.